Well, what a terrific privilege it is to talk to you today about what I believe to be the most powerful idea that evolution has created and built into the human design, which is the idea of compassion. And I'm trying to pull up our slides here. Let's see. And by the way, I also study embarrassment, so I'm perpetually embarrassed by my technological phobias and difficulties. So there we go. So historians have documented that on the world's battlefields, from Vietnam to the trenches of World War I, there's this really remarkable tendency for people in face-to-face combat to experience what they call sympathy breakthroughs, which is this overwhelming emotion of compassion in the act of committing harm against your mortal adversaries. Perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of a sympathy breakthrough was Miklos Niezli, who was working in the concentration camps, a doctor attending the gas chambers. And one day when killing a bunch of Jews, his staff discovered a young 16-year-old at the bottom of a pile of corpses who was alive. And reflexively, the staff on hand turned to her and acted in compassion. They gave her a jacket, some soup. They devised a plan to stow her away and lead to her freedom. And regrettably, the commandant on staff discovered this and actually executed the young girl with his favorite method, which is a shot to the back of a head. But clearly, there's this powerful emotion that you see in the most contrary and counterintuitive of circumstances, which is in adversarial combat, that we need to think about. Now, evolutionarily, in the early circles of evolutionary thought, this has produced something of a conundrum, which is, how do we think evolutionarily about the emergence of selfless behavior, the emergence of compassion? In early circles of evolutionary thought, this produced a parting of ways. Alfred Russel Wallace, one of the co-discoverers of evolution, said, something as noble, lofty, pro-social, selfless as compassion can't be shaped by raw evolution. Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, well known to many, took a similar cynical view to human nature and said, evolution really doesn't operate according to principles of compassion and sympathy and the like. Compassion, our feeling of goodwill for others, is a social construction. It's a contract that we form in human society. Charles Darwin arrived at a different hypothesis, which is one that has motivated the science I'm going to present to you today. It emerged, a lot of historians believe, out of his own experiences raising his children, a devoted dad of 10, and also out of his own suffering, where he had to nurse, as many of you might know, his young daughter to her early death at the age of 12 to tuberculosis. And Darwin made the very simple argument that human societies that have the most sympathetic members are more likely to flourish, and importantly, their offspring are more likely to reach the age of viability. Very flat-footed, sound, evolutionary reasoning. Now, let's take an evolutionary perspective upon this. These are two of our primate relatives, little infants of the primate, our own primate relatives. On the left is the wonderful bonobo, and on the right is the chimpanzee. Now, they are doing very unusual things for infants in the primate world, and the parents in this audience will recognize this, which is, first of all, they're sitting up, they're feeding themselves, and in fact, our offspring are born more vulnerable than any mammal on the face of the earth. Our offspring, with their giant heads coming out prematurely, take anywhere from 7 to 49 years to reach the age of independence. And I have to adjust that figure as the economy goes up and down, because people come to me and say, my son's still living in the basement and he's 62 years old, what do I do? From an evolutionary perspective, guided by Charles Darwin, we ask our first question. Does compassion have a signal that is shaped by evolution, crafted into our signaling modalities? And so, as a young scientist, having worked with Paul Ekman, I was thrilled by this hypothesis. We know the face has about 30 different muscles. Our facial musculature is very similar to the musculature of our primate relatives. When you go to remote parts of the world, like this photograph in Africa, you see the exact same displays as we would emit in parts of the Western world or where have you. And so in my lab, I documented that, indeed, that photo right there with the woman with these very endearing oblique eyebrows, that's what people look like in the face when they feel compassion. Excited, I took this photograph to the Philippines and Japan, different parts of the world, to see if other people in different cultures see that as compassion, and regrettably, I failed miserably. When people looked at this in different parts of the world, they said, She looks a little confused. I think she has back pain. She's a little constipated. And that was a disaster. And that's because I forgot one of the miracles of human evolution, which is our vocal apparatus. Our apparatus elongated as we started to walk upright. We developed this amazing wonder, this dexterous tongue, that gave us this remarkable bandwidth to communicate emotion through the voice as air particles come up through your voice, vibrate the vocal folds, and come out as sounds. And so we did a next study to ask, is there a compassionate signal in the human voice? Interestingly, in the non-human primate world, they emit little coos and gurns, we call them, when little non-human primate babies approach adults. And so here's the study that we did. In this particular study, we relied on the study of what we call vocal bursts, which are little half-second sounds that you can emit with your voice that communicate radically different emotions. Okay? Really interesting property of the voice, how rich it is to communicate these emotions. So let me give you an example that I have started to hear at the dinner table, in particular when I play my music around my preteen 12-year-old daughter. See how smart you guys are. This is the sound I hear her emit 20, 30 times a day. Right? I don't need to tell you anymore what that means. So we had participants try to communicate different emotions in the positive realm, and then we had other participants guess what that sound meant. And what you see in this graph is that indeed people are quite good, 5, 6 times the rate of chance, at identifying compassion in the human voice with half-second vocalizations. There's a sign of compassion in the human voice. The astute members of the audience may be a little bit despairing. You'll notice on the right that love actually doesn't have a vocal signal. In fact, I don't know how we communicate love, but that's a whole other topic. So, all right. Second idea that comes out of an evolutionary analysis of compassion is that for compassion and this selfless orientation to take hold in these small groups in which we evolved, human goodness has to be viral. It has to spread to others, our conspecifics, and reset our orientation from self-interest and competition to cooperation and other interest, if you will. Now, it turns out there are remarkable new findings in this new science of compassion on how contagious this powerful emotion is. When a little baby hears another baby cry, it emits a distress vocalization. It doesn't emit that distress vocalization when the little baby itself cries. If you put two friends together, their compassionate physiological profiles start to converge on each other. Work by Christakis at Harvard and Fowler at UC San Diego that you may have heard about is showing that simple acts of kindness, expressing gratitude, spreads to other people, and in turn spreads to other people those second individuals interact with during the day. It is a highly contagious emotion. So, to study the spread of compassion, I turn to another understudied language of human emotion, which is touch. Touch is the first language we're equipped to perceive when we're born into the world. We have this amazing hand crafted by evolution that is much more dexterous than the hands of other primates. We have an amazing physiological system called the skin, your largest organ, that has 3 layers of different cells that process information about the social world, sending signals right to your cortex to let you know what just happened in the brush to your neck or the pat on the back. It is an amazing system of communication. In non-human primates, they groom 20% of the day to build up social bonds. That little guy right there, I love him. Anybody know what that little tiny one is? It is the small-brained primate, George Bush. No, I'm kidding. That little guy is called a slow loris, and it is a primate that evolved. It's a tiny little sloth-like primate that evolved one finger that it only uses to touch its conspecifics. The reason why we now know from the neuroscience of touch is that when you touch somebody nicely on the forearm, you get activation in the reward circuits of the brain. It's as powerful as chocolate. When you touch people, it produces trusting behavior. In medical procedures, if you get a nice touch prior to a medical procedure, your stress-related physiology shuts down. It is essential. So I was interested with fellow students here at Berkeley in can we communicate trust and pro-sociality and compassion with simple touches to the forearm? Can we spread goodwill, as you will today, just by patting people on the back? Here's the study that we did. This is only the study that you would get away with at UC Berkeley. My first version, we wanted to know, can you communicate these emotions through touch? The first version, I can't believe I did this, was we blindfolded individuals. Another person came to the lab, and we said, go touch that guy over there, all these emotions. The poor guy sat there like, oh my God, you know. And I had one graduate student get arrested for that paradigm, but that is neither, no, I'm joking. So what we did is we built this barrier in our lab. You come to the lab, you stick your arm through, you give another participant a list of emotions to communicate, you reach over and touch that person's forearm and say, here's what I'm trying to communicate to you just through touch. And what you see in the blue bars, with chance being 8%, is that people are 5 to 6 to 7 times the rate of chance in communicating compassion, love, and gratitude through touch. Really remarkable data. I can't believe these findings. I'm ethically required to report them to you. We had all gender combinations in this study, and we only observed the following 2 gender differences. Think about these. When the woman tried to communicate anger to the man, he got nothing right. He had no idea what she was doing. And this one breaks my heart, which is that when the man tried to communicate compassion to the woman, she had no idea what that poor fool was doing. So, and I do. Now, this has led us to study touch in the most unlikely of places. You may have heard about this study we just did. We coded the language of trusting touch on the NBA court. All these crazy things NBA players do, from head slaps to flying hip bumps. Maybe we can demonstrate at the break. And indeed, what you find is that the more of this pro-social touch a team does early in the season, they do better at the end of the season. It is the language of cooperation. So let's round out our discussion. Is compassion an evolutionary adaptation? And in fact, if you look at this emotion, this powerful emotion, from the rigorous criteria of evolutionary thought, it meets a lot of these criteria. We know humans and non-human primates who are more compassionate raise offspring that are more likely to survive. What this graph on the right here presents is evidence suggesting you will do better in the reproductive game of attracting a mate if you are compassionate. The far bars on the right show that in 37 different nations, the most important criterion in picking a mate, and I hope my daughters hear this, is the kindness of the potential mate. We also know socially, the more pro-social individuals, and there's a whole rich scholarship around this, are faring better in terms of their social networks, their rise in social hierarchies. Very important. Compassion is an adaptation. So is compassion built into our nervous systems, as Darwin long ago argued? In our lab, we present images of harm and suffering to our participants, like these right here. What you observe, quite remarkably, is activation in an old part of the mammalian brain called the periaqueductal gray, which is associated with nurturant behavior in different mammalian species. Compassion is an old part of the nervous system, not a recent addition in the frontal lobes. It is a basic process of mammalian social behavior. That little part of the brain, called the periaqueductal gray, is loaded up with oxytocin receptors. You've probably been hearing about the oxytocin story. It is a little sequence of 9 amino acids produced in the hypothalamus. It goes to your brain. It floats through your bloodstream. I wish they could serve it in the sandwiches at lunch today, but they can't. But scientists find that oxytocin produces monogamy in mammals. It produces caregiving behavior. This graph that I represent shows that in economic games, if you give somebody oxytocin with a little nasal spray, you can only do this research in Switzerland and Germany, by the way, half the people give away all their money to a stranger at unprecedented levels of generosity. And the economists in the house were like, now I know the kind of startup I should start. So this neuroscience led us to study a particular gene Are there selfless genes? We've been taught that genes are selfish and that individuals are bags of bones to propagate the particular gene. Now let's turn it on its head. Are there genes that actually promote behavior that makes you benefit other human genomes or other individuals? On the third chromosome is a little particular gene with different polymorphisms that helps regulate the oxytocin system. And there's one profile, the GG profile of this selfless gene, that relates to a lot of prosocial behavior. And what we have just started to document is if you have this sort of healthy oxytocin genetic polymorphism, you're more altruistic, you read emotion better, you're more generous to strangers, you respond with stronger compassion to suffering. There are genes in our bodies that help us with selfless behavior. This science helps us discard cynical views of human nature or call them into question. Sigmund Freud, the idea that we have this commandment, thou shalt not kill, tells us we have descended from generations of murderers. That's what I would have inferred from that. Ayn Rand, the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, if a civilization is to survive, it is the morality of altruism that men have to reject. We see where that has gotten us. And instead, we could turn to other perspectives. For example, in the East, one of the tenets of Buddhist thought is that we have this inherent compassion to discover in the mind, and if we abide by it in our social behaviors, is the surest pathway to human happiness. So, where are we as a culture with respect to compassion? This culture, today, right now. Let's do a little test. This is survey data asking, how much do citizens trust their fellow citizens in different industrialized countries? Just sort of take a moment. The higher the score, the greater the percentage of trust. What do you think? Well, it turns out with adults, the USA is underperforming in terms of our trust of fellow citizens. There are economic and social and health costs to that underperformance. How about our children? This was a UNICEF study from 2004 that rated, again, 21 industrialized nations in terms of their compassion. Where are we? The higher the bar, the worse we do. And here, we are 20th out of 21 industrialized nations. You may be happy that we're beating the British, but we always beat the British. But we're not doing well. I'll close by saying that when we put compassion to use, as institutions, technologies are increasingly doing so, we do very well. There's a lot of neat evidence saying we're seeing drops in violence, drops in bullying, increases in more compassionate parenting practices. It is, I think, the most powerful idea that human evolution has produced. Thank you very much.